Imagine going to your regular office job in November 1979. You grab some breakfast and some coffee on the way to work. You get there, chit chat with coworkers. You have meetings, contact the media, help people with paperwork and administrative work. But your office is the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4th, 1979. Tensions are high because it's the middle of the Cold War and the country of Iran has undergone a revolution. The despised American-backed Shah has been run out of the country, and now a popular and radical cleric by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini is putting an Islamic republic into place. He runs the country on hating America, who has interfered in Iran since the 1950s at least, and toppled democratic leaders in favor of a Shah who gave the oil industry over to the West. You see tension and you see protests, but you do not expect what would happen that day. I am Doris Smith. I'm an independent journalist. This is the journalism of everything. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian student militants called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, climbed over the embassy walls and stormed into the compound within minutes. U.S. Marines assigned to protect the embassy were told not to shoot and that Washington would solve this matter diplomatically within 18 hours. The militants initially captured 66 Americans and took them hostage, though the women, African Americans, and one who was very ill were released, leaving 52 for the duration of not 18 hours, but 444 days. From November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981, you are blindfolded, isolated, interrogated, subjected to death threats, psychological torture, and uncertainty about what is going to happen to you. You don't know that your government is working behind the scenes to try to get you released. You don't know that there was a failed rescue mission. All you know is isolation, torture, desperation, and uncertainty. So why did the Iranian hostage crisis happen? Why were these student militants so angry? And why did they take this desperate step to take hostages? I've discussed in previous episodes that life in Iran for your regular students was really tough. The economy was terrible, and Iranians blamed the Shah and the United States for their circumstances. They really hated the Shah. The Shah had fled the country, largely driven out, but also because he was sick with lymphoma. In October 1979, the United States allowed the Shah in for medical treatment, and this infuriated many Iranians. The Iranians didn't trust that this was purely a humanitarian gesture, which is what the Americans were saying, and they believed that this was a way to eventually put the Shah back into power in Iran to benefit the United States and not Iranians. While these students were supporters of Khomeini, This isn't something that he directly ordered, or at least that we could prove. He did support the hostage takeover, though, and took advantage of the situation to rally the more militant anti-American Iranians and gain their support. Khomeini didn't address the embassy takeover for a few days, but showed support, calling it the, quote, second revolution, and that the embassy was a, quote, nest of spies. President Jimmy Carter and his administration were adamant initially that this conflict would be resolved with diplomacy. He used all of the diplomatic channels available at the time, including going to the United Nations and appealing to the allies of the United States to try to get the hostages released. They tried a legal route through the International Court of Justice to put it on the record that Iran was violating diplomatic law. Unfortunately, the International Court couldn't really force Iran to comply, but did help validate that this was an international crisis rather than an isolated incident. The United States didn't have much direct communication with Iran at the time, especially since the embassy was compromised. So it had to rely on intermediaries like outside countries and the UN to negotiate. One diplomatic tactic that Carter tried was to be willing to discuss why the Iranians were upset or discuss grievances if the hostages were released. Carter wasn't trying to use a heavy hand in these negotiations, and he was largely criticized for this by opponents and by just constant media coverage. While Jimmy Carter tried to assuage the militants about the Shah, they were never thoroughly convinced that the U.S. didn't want to put him back into power in Iran. This was undoubtedly Carter's biggest diplomatic hurdle, to convince the militants that the U.S. was just trying to help the Shah with medical care and that he would not be put into power again. By April of 1980, Carter had to increase the pressure on the Iranians because soft tactics were not working. He froze Iranian assets and applied sanctions on Iran, but this essentially closed any remaining direct communication with Iran. That same month, the U.S. attempted to launch a rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, but it was a disaster. The mission was complicated to begin with because the hostages were being held deep in Tehran, and we really didn't have any real allies that could assist us. It took 5 months just to plan the mission. The basic plan was for 3 MC-130s, which are special operations airplanes, to carry 118 troops from Mazara Island near Oman to a remote desert staging site they called Desert 1. Desert 1 was about 200 miles southeast of Tehran, and it was supposed to be remote and secluded and secret. From there, 8 RH-53 Delta helicopters that were coming from the USS Nimitz were going to meet the airplanes to then carry the troops to a hide site closer to Tehran. The next night, they had trusted associates within Tehran to drive the assault force into Tehran closer to the embassy. So the troops could basically storm the embassy and recover the hostages. They were hoping, obviously, to be secret and swift and stealth. And nearby Mazariya, U.S. Army Rangers were there to secure an airfield to load C-141 airplanes and fly everyone out of Tehran. This mission depended on a lot of things to go right, and none of them did. Several night missions, large forces of aircraft and soldiers not being noticed, and weather conditions all had to be perfect for this plan to work out. but it was a bust. And not to my surprise, as much as I value and love helicopters and the military and believe them and their pilots to be extraordinary, the helicopters were the weak point. 2 helicopters left the USS Nimitz already having electrical problems and had to turn back. One left with hydraulic problems and tried to continue the mission, maybe get to Desert 1 and be fixed. But let me tell you something. If you're flying a complex helicopter without any or many hydraulics and the instruments, it's like arm wrestling a grizzly bear. Just like a helicopter, combined with the laws of physics that it defies, a grizzly bear wants you dead and will fight you every step of the way until one of you wins. And usually it's the grizzly bear or it's the helicopter. The helicopters that did make it into Iran flew into a really bad dust storm that they were not expecting and were basically inoperable after that. Helicopters, with all of its whirring parts, both outward whirring parts and inward ones, are in fine desert sand, are just an absolute disaster. And there's just too many spinning parts to clean out. It's awful. The first MC-130 was able to reach that remote desert strip, Desert 1. And the Air Force combat controllers, and those are the guys that kind of go out and set up airfields and clear out space. They're considered Air Force special operations. They really do amazing things. These guys were starting to set up the area when a civilian passenger bus came down the road right through the landing zone. So much for being secret. The U.S. had to give up its element of surprise and detain the passengers. And then a fuel cup truck that came down the same road, the combat controllers had to blow it up. And I think there was also another truck that tried to come through too. I mean, just not secret at all, completely discovered. President Carter called off the rescue mission due to all of these issues, and it was a just absolute disaster. The hostages were moved into another prison once the rescue mission was outed, but unfortunately, the disaster was just beginning. The mission had been scrubbed, but there were still airplanes, helicopters, and combat controllers that needed to be withdrawn. Upon withdrawal, one of the helicopters struck an EC-130 that was full on fuel, and 2 American aircraft collided on the ground after refueling at another location, and they exploded. In all, 8 service members, 5 of which were airmen and 3 Marines, were killed. Not only was there a large loss of life, the failure of this mission exposed a lot of organizational weaknesses within the special operations community. And it was just a huge embarrassment to the United States and especially to the Carter administration. Many historians believe that this was the end of President Jimmy Carter's presidency. He was seeking a second term, but the slow negotiations and failed military mission just made President Carter look like a weak president. The failure of Operation Eagle Claw completely stopped any negotiations with Iran because Iran found this attempt to be military aggression. By November of 1980, the Iranian parliament formally announced 4 official conditions for the hostages to be released. 1, the United States must return the Shah's wealth to Iran. 2, the U.S. must cancel claims against Iran related to the revolution. 3, the United States must unfreeze Iranian assets that had been frozen after the embassy had been seized. And 4, the U.S. must promise not to interfere in Iran's internal affairs in the future. Of all of the intermediary countries involved with the negotiations. Algeria became the most successful mediator. Algerian diplomats passed messages between Washington and Tehran and was an ideal mediator for several reasons. It had good relations with both countries, and it was seen as a relatively neutral entity. The biggest key, though, was that Algeria had diplomatic access to the Iranian revolutionary government. By September of 1980, Iran was in a large-scale war with Iraq. Iran desperately needed its frozen financial assets to fund the war. Shah Pahlavi had died on July 27, 1980, in Cairo, so he was no longer really a factor. Remember, he was a big sticking point before. The negotiations were reaching a peak because each side really wanted this crisis to be over. The Algiers Accords were finalized on January 19, 1981, and each side made concessions. The U.S. agreed to unfreeze the billions of dollars in Iranian assets, suspend any legal claims against Iran in U.S. courts, and, this is a big one, agreed not to intervene in Iran's internal affairs. In return, Iran agreed to release the hostages and submit their financial disputes with the U.S. to arbitration. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan's inauguration day, after 444 days in captivity, the 52 American hostages were finally released. Jimmy Carter really doesn't get the credit he deserved for these negotiations, especially due to the optics of the hostages being released right after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. Obviously, Reagan wasn't in power at the time and he didn't have anything to do with the long-term negotiations, but it looked like he was the key to them being released. I think Americans have short memories, or even just aren't aware at how history shapes our future. And the Iranian hostage crisis can directly be linked to our current 2026 war in Iran. The hostage crisis led to a devastating psychological and political break between the U.S. and Iran that never healed. I've already covered how Iranians largely distrusted the United States because of its political interference within the country. After the hostage crisis, Americans began to view Iran as hostile, violent, vehemently anti-American, and willing to take drastic measures. Americans no longer trusted Iran and no longer saw them as an ally. The Iranian hostage crisis completely severed diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran. The embassy in Tehran was removed, and there has not been an embassy in Tehran since 1980. Some people thought that Obama put one in again, but he just did improve relations a little bit, but there's never been an embassy established again in Tehran. Any negotiations between the U.S. and Iran have largely been through back channels and intermediary countries, especially Algeria, Switzerland, and Oman. The hostage crisis proved to Iran that asymmetric warfare, not conventional warfare, was most effective against the United States. Iran has used militias and proxy groups like Hezbollah and commercial disruption tactics such as targeting shipping channels to counter the power of the United States. Obviously, there have been decades of back and forth between the United States and Iran since 1980 and the Iranian Hostage Crisis. Too much to cover in even 5 episodes. But I think it's important for us in the West to realize that relations between the US and Iran are not black and white, like America is good, Iran is bad. In fact, the United States has a large part in turning Iranians against us. And we need to recognize these roots as we are engaged in another example of our meddling without a stated or reasonable cause outside of our own selfish interests. And we have to consider the repercussions of our aggression amongst the civilian population. Are we just making more enemies out of Iranian citizens? Most likely, yes. The Iranian hostage crisis didn't end in 1981. Not really. It just changed form. It became sanctions. It became proxy wars. It became nuclear standoffs. It became decades of mistrust, miscalculation, and missed chances. And now, in 2026, it has become war. Because history doesn't disappear, it accumulates. Every decision, every intervention, every act of retaliation builds on the last. So the question isn't just how the hostage crisis ended. The question is whether we ever actually learned anything from it, or whether we've been replaying the same conflict for the last 45 years.